Hello, welcome to True Tabletop Painting, my video series where I show you how to paint models. If this is your first time watching, I would definitely recommend you check out the What is True Tabletop Painting video I've thrown together. It's just a quick little video that gives you some background on what it is I do, the methods that I like, and it just gives a lot of good context for what you're going to see in the painting videos. But that being said, like, subscribe, comment, all the typical YouTube stuff. And let's just dive right in and start painting She-Hulk from Marvel Crisis Protocol. Alright, so we've got our model here primed with some spray Wraithbone. First thing with any model is to decide on the color scheme, and for She-Hulk I'll obviously be using a green skin tone. For her outfit I figured I'd go blue and white since a lot of people in the box art already used purple. And for her hair I'm just going to go with black or a similar dark color, and the I-beam will be a dark metal. In general, I tend to paint the large sections of the model first, and then I kind of work my way down to the finer details. So for She-Hulk, this means I'm going to start with her skin and her outfit. For the skin, I'm going to be using Warp Lightning here. I think the brighter green is a nice fit for her. At this stage, I try to keep it in the lines, so to speak, but I'm cleaning up the edges afterwards, so I don't worry too much about it right now. Similarly, I try to avoid any major streaks where I can, but that also gets cleaned up later in the process, so right now it's really just about getting kind of a nice, even coverage. After my first pass with the green, I'm going to take some Wraithbone and clean up any of the edges that I might have flubbed. Since it's primed with the Wraithbone, it makes it easy to stay consistent with cleanup and edging and all that stuff. Here we can see the mostly covered skin of the model. The green looks nice, I think, and you can see shading going on, which is what you want with the contrast paints. But obviously it's clearly a little streaky and splotchy right now, but that's fine because we're going to fix that in a little bit. Next up is Ultramarines blue for her outfit. I decided to invert the colors, putting the blue down the center and the white on the sides, mainly just to make her look a little bit different from other paint jobs I've seen. You always want paints to be a little unique. I certainly do, and it can be tricky with these established IPs like Marvel. So I, take my little bits where I can find them. Finishing up the shoes and gloves, and you can see it's starting to look a bit more like a painted model right now. Again, you can see the shading looks nice, the colors look good, but it's clearly a little bit messy. What I'm going to do right now is just clean up the fingers on the gloves and get those painted green so that we can then focus on kind of smoothing out the contrast paint. You can see we've got the base colors pretty much blocked out on the model now. So the first step of my two-part kind of patented method here is we're going to dry brush everything with Terminatus Stone Dry paint. Right now I'm a little messy with it just because it's going on everything, and that's okay because again this is part one of the smoothing process to kind of get that splotchiness out of the contrast. So clearly the Terminatus Stone picks out a lot of highlights on the model, but it's chalky, I guess would be the nice way to put it. So now we're going to go into step 2 of kind of my method here, what I call the contrast dry brush. So this next part is exactly what it sounds like, you're dry brushing with contrast paint. Like with any dry brushing, you're going to get paint on your brush and then you're going to wipe it off on a paper towel. You'll see I typically wipe only a couple times because being that the contrast paint is a different consistency, you can easily wipe off too much paint if you really kind of go into it like you would with a dry brush paint. Once you've got the paint on the brush, you just very lightly brush it over all of the surfaces of the model. The trick with this is making sure not to go too heavy because then you will lose any of the highlighting you get from that Terminatus stone. For this skin dry brushing, I'm using the same Warp Lightning color that I used for the base color. When doing this method, you can either use the same color that you used for your base, or you can use a different lighter color, which I'll do with the bodysuit. And you can see it'll give different effects based on what you choose. For She-Hulk's suit, I'm doing Talassar blue. Otherwise, it's the same method that I did with the skin of the dry brushing with contrast paint. With the contrast dry brushing done, you can really see the end state of the model starting to come together. The streaking splotchiness of the contrast paint is definitely reduced, and you've got some nice shading and highlights showing through now. As you can see with the green, if you contrast dry brush with the same color as the base you used, you get a very subtle effect, whereas with the blue, you can see using the lighter color creates more distinction in the highlights. It really just comes down to preference when you're doing this. I tend to mix and match my choices in my models, kind of like what I'm doing with She-Hulk here. It all just depends on the effect that I'm going for. With the green and the blue done, at this point I'm now going to take some more Wraithbone and I'm going to clean up the white areas around She-Hulk's costume. I'm also going to use this to clean up the hair, getting it ready for the black coloring I'm going to use. And I'll also use the Wraithbone to pick out the details on the blue of the outfit. So the straps on the shoes and the little zipper kind of neckline piece at the top. I like using Wraithbone as the white for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a slightly more subtle white, so then if you want to bust out something like a white scar or other very bright white paints, it shows up even more on the model. The other nice thing is if you make a mistake when you're using that Wraithbone to either, add some white details or clean up an edge, it's very easy to fix that because then you just use the contrast paint and you don't lose any of the highlighting or shading because the contrast paint is thin enough and subtle enough that unless you make a huge blunder, you're typically going to be able to cover it up with just a drop or two of the contrast. At this stage, I'm now using some Apothecary white contrast to add some shadow to She-Hulk's white bodysuit. You can see it comes off pretty light bluish, light gray when you're first putting it on. Especially with Apothecary white, you kind of got to go a little heavy to get any of the shade. But again, we're going to do a little bit of the dry brushing, and that'll kind of clean that up after the fact. I'm also going to use this just to pick out a little bit of the shadows on the straps and the neckline part, although I'm not going to worry about dry brushing that because it's small enough of a detail. While I wait for the Apothecary white to dry, I'm going to work on She-Hulk's hair. I'm going to start with just some black Templar contrast. Oftentimes when you're painting black, sometimes people suggest that you use, maybe a dark purple or blue, because black can be hard to read or hard to highlight against. But I find with the contrast dry brush technique that I use, I get pretty good results going with just the black base and then highlighting off of it, which you'll see in a little bit. switching back to the bodysuit while the hair dries, I'm now going to do some dry brushing with Wrack White Dry paint. This instance, I'm actually not going to do any kind of contrast on top of this. This is the technique I typically use for large pieces of white on my models, is with the Wraithbone Base and then the Apothecary white shading. I'll then dry brush with the Wrack White, which is nice and bright, and then it gives you that really kind of popping white color in the figure. It's pretty much the only time I don't use the Terminatus Stone Dry brush, or kind of a layer over this, and so you'll see the dry brushing I'm doing is probably a little bit more in line with what you would expect to see for kind of normal dry brushing. So you can see the white of the suit really is pretty bright now with the way I did it. And as I said, I don't really bother with the straps or the little neckline piece because they're small enough you're not going to really be able to tell the difference, from a distance. Next up, I'll be doing the two-part process on her hair. So as with the other steps, I start with the Terminatus Stone and dry brush that across the top liberally. And then actually for the highlight, I'm going to be using Ork Flesh. When doing black hair, I like to use other colors most of the time for contrast dry brushing. It kind of gives the highlights a different feel. In a lot of cases, I usually do like blue or purple. She-Hulk, I'm going to do green because I think it's best. It gives the hair more of a greenish hue, which you can see in the comics a lot. I didn't go with Warp Lightning as I wanted it to be a more subtle shade rather than with that brighter green. It would have looked like really strong green highlights. Again, that's just personal preference on the model. The other thing with this method that I do like is that it helps amplify the black overall. If you've ever used Black Templar, if you just use a coat of that, you see a lot of white coming through from the primer. It looks kind of like dirty gray more than actual black. But when you add that extra color from the contrast dry brush, whatever it is, green or blue or purple, it deepens the color really nicely, which I like. So you can see the black looks a lot darker now, but it's got those nice deep green highlights to it. Alrighty, now it's time for the worst part of every single paint job, tackling the face. I wish I could say I've figured out some magic technique for this or something, but it really is just magnifying jeweler's glasses and a whole lot of patience. So first thing I do is put some Wraithbone in for the eyes. It works well for a couple reasons. First is that since it's not a bright white, it doesn't make the eyes look super cartoony, kind of like beacons in the dark or something. The other benefit is that it makes it really easy to clean up any mistakes because since it matches the primer color, when you paint over it with contrast, it'll already match your paint job. So as long as you don't make a huge mistake in the face, any fixes you do will be unnoticeable. You don't have to worry about reshading or highlighting or any of that. For the pupils, I'm going to be using Ork Green. You want a dark color, and you can't really tell at a distance. I still like to make the pupils kind of stick in with the green aesthetic for She-Hulk. So it's there if you really look for it, but again, it doesn't really matter as long as they're dark pupils. And then for the lips and eyebrows, I'm just using Ork Green again as well, just to kind of match the rest of the model. Not going anything super fancy, although I will say the lips do look a little silly with that dark of a color, but at the end of the day you can see them from the table, so I guess it works. With that, She-Hulk's face is done, and She-Hulk herself is pretty much finished. So now it's just on to the base and the I-beam, and then she's done. To start the I-beam off, I'm going to paint it in Leadbelcher. It's kind of my go-to metallic paint. I like how dark it is and metallic looking, and it's very easy to apply. There's no real issues with it. It's my favorite. It's my favorite metallic paint of the GW line. While the I-beam's drying, I'm going to do the base, and for all my Marvel Crisis Protocol figures, I just do a layer of Dawnstone paint. Nothing fancy, there's no, multiple colors or anything like that. It's just a very basic, close to cement color already, so I just start with that as my base color. Switching back to the I-beam, I'm going to give it a coat of Aggaros Dunes Contrast. This is typically what I do with a lot of my metallics. Is I have Leadbelcher, I think I've got one of the silver ones and a gold or two. I got a couple of random metallics, but obviously there's a huge variety out there. But what I like to do is I like to use either one of my silvers or golds, like Leadbelcher or something, and then I'll cover it in a contrast to give it a different feel. So you can see here, I'm taking it away from that silverish hue and making it more brown, kind of industrial, dirty looking, for lack of a better term. This is the part where you got to be a little bit careful. You got to kind of smooth out the contrast as best you can, because it does show the streaking really significantly on the metallic paints. So you can see I'm going, a couple different times making sure that I get any of the streaks out. But it does look really good once you're finally done with it. Now that the I-beam's got that nice brownish bronze color, I'm going to let that dry and switch back over to the base. This is, again, just very quick and dirty. That's why this is tabletop painting. I just take some Basilicanum gray contrast paint, and as you can see, I go pretty heavy with it. Just the entirety of the gray gets covered with it. There's not really any technique to it. I do a lot of the ink to make sure that it really picks out the shadows, because again, if it looks a little dark, it still looks like concrete, so that's all I really care about. The one thing I'll do with these particular bases, because they are sculpted, is I will pick out a lot of the lines and creases and any of the kind of the very heavy places where the shadow would pool. I'll pick that out in the Basilicanum gray specifically, just to really kind of make those lines and those cracks pop. Now I'm just going to go back to the I-beam and finish it up by dry brushing a little Screaming Bell on it, just to try to pick out some highlights, give it a little bit more differentiation of the tone of the metallics. After that, I'm going to use a little Iyanden yellow contrast to paint the sidewalk kind of crossing guard area on the base. And then after that, it's just putting some Abaddon black, slapping some black on the ring of the base to clean it up, and She-Hulk will be done. And here she is in all her completed green glory. I'm really happy with how the shading on the skin came out and the overall look of the model. Only thing in hindsight, I think, is as I look at it, it's a little too much of a Fantastic Four vibe with the blue and white on the outfit, but otherwise I think she came out great and certainly looked good on the table. So I hope you enjoyed the video, maybe learned something new, or just feel a little more confident in your own painting skills. And either way, I look forward to sharing my next painting with you, and we'll see you next time.